All right, I guess we'll start. Today's lecture is titled Rabbi Mendes, the most important rabbi that you never heard of. So I could see that my uncle Louis Shamie is here praising Congregation She'erit Israel on the Upper West Side, so he perhaps knows who Rabbi Mendes is, but for the rest of us, he's somebody that we've probably never heard of. But he's probably one of the most important rabbis to ever live in the United States of America. Just by a show of hands, or even if you want to text into the chat as we go along, of course, you're always welcome to post questions there. Just give me a thumbs up if you hear me. Does everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay. Excellent. So before I start, I'd just like to thank the SCA for setting this up. I think it's really such a beautiful thing that we have this going on, Yom Yerushalayim, that we're celebrating properly. It is a Friday, so let's see. Okay, let's start. Okay, so we're talking about Rabbi Haim Mendes. Okay, he was born in London, passed away in New York City, and we're going to talk about a little bit of his life and accomplishments, but specifically to understand his unique version of what he called Bible Zionism. For many of us, we may have never heard of Rabbi Mendes, so I'll challenge you, for many, especially the people that went to Hebrew day school, to answer the question, how come you never heard of him? And you'll see why that question is pertinent, hopefully by the end of the presentation. Secondly, sometimes it becomes difficult to articulate in American Jewry today, what exactly is the Zionism that quote unquote we believe? Sometimes that could be a fluid thing, sometimes it could be stagnant, but at times it's often challenged. I could just give a quick story. 3 years ago, 2017, I was in Chicago for an Israel Educators Conference. And it was Yom Yerushalayim, the 50th anniversary. And shockingly, they did almost nothing to celebrate Yom Yerushalayim. For them, it was the tragedy of what happened to the Arab people, the Palestinian people. Now, while human suffering is something that I, of course, empathize with, it missed the point. If you believe in Zionism, what's your motivation for Zionism? If the only thing you can say on Yom Yerushalayim, the 50th anniversary of the reunification of our holiest place, the only thing you could say is, well, what about the rights of the Palestinians? And that also just historically, what about the rights of the Jews that were being sniped at and that were discriminated against from 48 to 1967? As you can see here on the screen, Rabbi Mendes was a tremendously accomplished scholar and Jewish leader. He served for over 60 years in Congregation She'erit Israel. He was the founder or co-founder of the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Orthodox Union. He was also Herzl's personally appointed delegate to the United States to spread Zionism, to introduce and to spread Zionism. Whoops. Go to the beginning here. Okay. So for those who are not familiar with Congregation She'erit Israel, it's the first congregation in the United States of America, founded in 1654. It's a Sephardic congregation, and Rabbi Mendes served as the rabbi there from 1877 to 1837. His role in leadership there was not just as a communal rabbi, but much broader than that, in the sense that he was a representative of Judaism to the wider New York City and even the general national community of the United States of America. It was something that he did not take very lightly, and he has a lot of writings that discuss it, but that's not the focus of today, so I'm going to, even though I don't want to, I'm going to gloss over some of these details. but it's still, of course, there on 71st Street. It's a very formidable building. You can go visit it during normal times. I was able to visit it right before Corona in the beginning of March. Okay, the next very important institution which he co-founded is the Jewish Theological Seminary. Now, while the Jewish Theological Seminary deviated from its original purpose and founding, it was nonetheless founded by Rabbi Mendes, and it's one of the formidable Jewish institutions that throughout the 20th century. So it's really to his credit. What Rabbi Mendes does in 1886 with his fellow or his counterpart rabbi from Philadelphia, also Sephardic, Dr. Sabato Morias, is he sees a tremendous need for education and Jewish-born leadership in the United States. More specifically, he realizes that there's a challenge of American-born rabbis and communal leaders that need basic education, and then, of course, more advanced education that can articulate Judaism in a masterful way. So he founds JTS in an effort to stem the tide of assimilation and of many of the community ills. Just to clarify, 100%, so there's no confusion on the point. What's very interesting here is that he's also the founder of the Orthodox Union. So if we judge it by today, what's sort of strange is he founds two. If we look at it from, of course, hindsight's 20/20, but if we look at it from today's perspective, it's two diametrically opposed institutions. One is the Orthodox Union, and the other is the leading institution of the conservative Jewish movement. But of course, we need to realize that the conservative Jewish movement didn't even exist at this time. You can see over here on the right a short little clip that I pulled out from the sixth annual, I guess they had a annual dinner for the Orthodox Union. So as the first founder and president, he made clear, where his position is on the things that we might find, as observant Jews, contemptible in the Reform movement. The Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America was formed 2.5 years ago to protest against declarations of Reform rabbis not in accord with the teachings of our Torah, Nevi'im, and accepted rulings of recognized sages of Israel. It stands for loyalty to Jewish law and custom. So he was a 100% observant Jew. He also happened to be a medical doctor, and he really had long-lasting impact on American Jewry, particularly in the conservative movement and the Orthodox movement. Now, the next thing that he founded in 1898, and he was the first founding president, was the Orthodox Union in 1898, which we just alluded to. Unlike the Jewish Theological Seminary, I'll just go back a second. This paragraph on the left was actually taken from the Jewish Theological Seminary's website. And they still give credit to Rabbi Mendes and Rabbi Morias, whereas very interestingly, I couldn't find anything about Rabbi Mendes on the Orthodox Union's website. So just point of interest. To dig up the original Constitution and Charter was also sort of difficult, but the one on the top left is what is part of a clipping that I took out from Rabbi Mendes. It's to advance the purpose, and this is again the Constitution of the Orthodox Union was to advance the interest of positive biblical, rabbinical, traditional, and historical Judaism, and we affirm our adherence to the authoritative interpretation of our rabbis as contained in the Talmud and the codes. Just to give a sense of where American Jewry was at the time of the founding in the late 19th century, the Reform Jews were actually voting if they should change the day, the observance of Shabbat, whatever their observance was, from Saturday to Sunday. So this is at a time where there's a tremendous people that are millions of Jews are coming from overseas. They are rushing to become acculturated. They're rushing to become Americanized. And the Orthodox Union sees themselves as the stalwart or the bulwark against that assimilation. Of course, many people will delude themselves and say, oh, maybe I could just be Reform Judaism, I could be in token, I could be in name Judaism. But, you know, we all know what happened to the Reform Jews and the conservative Jews in this country, with their amazingly high assimilation and intermarriage rates. It's also a time of tremendous disunity, and there's really challenges that Rabbi Mendes leads. For over 7 years, he leads the charge as the first president. He asks actually to resign several times due to poor health, and they don't let him. Despite that, he stays on as president. But there is a plethora of issues that without any organized Orthodox body, no one is advocating for the Jews. Just a couple of things that I'll mention parenthetically. Again, I really want to get to the Zionism portion, but just a few things to talk about. First of all, there were problems with Brit Milah, especially on the Lower East Side. There were instances where, due to a lack of any medical or hygiene know-how, there were instances where baby boys were getting infected and they were dying from Brit Milah. So the Orthodox Union came in, they set up standards much like today with Mesisa Bapeh, and they tried to just at least educate the different Mohalim and different communal leaders as to the risks of not using proper hygiene when doing Brit Milah. Another issue was that certain states, including Massachusetts, where Boston is, sizable Jewish community, was attempting to outlaw shechita. Now, you know, ritual slaughter, without ritual slaughter, there is no meat, right? There's no refrigeration back then, and this is a tremendous challenge. The Reform Jews, of course, don't care, but for the Orthodox Jews, they need to have a unified voice in advocating for religious freedoms and toleration. Other issues that exist are many Jewish observant workers work either for the city or in the military, and they, of course, or even in school, in city college, and they need to have also a dispensation so that they don't have to come to work or to school or to fight in the military on religious days. Again, the Reform don't care about these issues, and in the hodgepodge of all the different, especially Eastern European Ashkenazic communities that don't speak English, have no cohesion between different edot and congregations. Rabbi Mendes's leadership is essential, and he unites them. Also, education-wise, we already know that he was a tremendous advocate of education through his founding of the JTS. But even in this period, he's helping all the upcoming yeshivot, the Talmud Torahs that are dotted all over the Lower East Side. He's uniting them. He's helping them come up with core curriculums. He's at least coming up with a system for those that can't pay to help them pay, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I don't want to belabor these points, but we can't ignore them because today I really want to talk about his approach to Zionism. But you have to understand the person, because the person is a person that really accomplished so much in the Jewish world that today we might take for granted, but back then it was nothing short of a Herculean task. From the founding of JTS, ensuring that we have communal leaders and educated rabbis, to setting up kosher standards, and fighting for the religious rights of Jews all over the country. You know, it was really amazing what he was able to accomplish. So Sherit Israel, the OU, and JTS, really, you know, he led the helm on these issues for a long time. So now it begs the question, if he's such a big communal leader during this period, where does he stand with the issues of Zionism? So Zionism was really focused in on, you know, it was based at the time in London. And Herzl, of course, was based, you know, the whole Zionist movement was based in London. Now, being an Orthodox rabbi, he had a very different approach from many of the secular atheist Jews that were involved in the endeavor. Since today is Yerushalayim, I'd like to start off of what he felt about Yerushalayim and how he saw that in his Zionist mission. So we have an interesting passage that appears twice in Tanach, once in Yeshaya and once in the book of Micha. Very famous, that speaks about Yerushalayim being a beacon of peace and an inspiration to the world. Rabbi Mendes doesn't think that Zionism has to be something that's just for the Jews. If anybody's ever read Rabbi Sassoon's piece on why did the Torah need Israel at all, it's so that ancient Israel was able to set up a model society and to model good behavior, ethics, morality, and be a light onto nations. And so too in the the times of the Messiah. So if we read these, I'll read Micha piece briefly. I think it really speaks to what Rabbi Mendes is all about. So at the time of the Messiah, all of the nations will come and want to be a part of Jerusalem. For those that are aware of late 19th century imperial history, the story was that the powers in Europe were all fighting over the Holy Land. They called that the Eastern Question. If anybody that's been to Jerusalem, you'll see different churches that are all built in all over Jerusalem. Those were set up by the governments of the imperial powers. For example, the Russians set up the Eastern Orthodox churches in order to get a foothold in Israel. And it was a big question, what would be the outcome of the Holy Land in the territorial conquest of the imperial European powers? Anyway, Pasuk Bet, והלכו גויים רבים ואמרו, לכו ונעלה אל הר אדוני ואל בית אלוהי יעקב ויורנו מדרכיו ונלכה באורחותיו. And so the prophet here says, the people will want to go to Jerusalem, not for territorial conquest, but they're going to want to go to learn from the God of Jacob. Because the word of God comes out of Jerusalem. Sorry. And there's going to be a reckoning of judgment, and all of the nations will turn their swords into plowshares. They're going to turn all their weapons into instruments of peace and prosperity. Okay? They're not going to teach any more war. They're just going to have peace. In other words, world peace. There'll be economic prosperity. Every nation will go in its own way. And it goes on to say, he'll gather in all of the exiles. So this vision, this messianic vision for world peace is going to start in Jerusalem. The nations of the world will actually want to come to Yerushalayim to learn from the Jews how to be peaceful, how to learn from the Jews and to turn their weapons into instruments of peace and prosperity and economic advancement. So it's really unbelievable to Rabbi Mendes. He says, look, we have the people, there is a possibility, he writes about this extensively, multiple texts. He really believes that the Eastern question of the imperial powers can actually be solved by answering what's also known in the 19th century as the Jewish problem. The Jewish problem is the problem of what do we do with these Jews that have a dual loyalty? On one hand, they want emancipation, they want to be free, they want to be let's say, citizens of Germany or Italy or England. But we know that every Jew prays 3 times a day and wants to go to Israel. So some Jews, like the Reformed Jews, say, well, we don't want to go to Israel anymore. So that's the end of that question. But many Orthodox, many traditional and observant Jews say, well, how do we answer that question? Rabbi Mendes' answer is a brilliant question, brilliant answer. He says, in the same way that Catholics don't have a dual loyalty to Rome and to wherever they're living, so too Jews can live in England, but also have a religious and a spiritual loyalty to Israel. So he finds this very interesting balance. And he says, because Jews don't really have any of these world conquests initiatives that are, ingrained in their psyche, he says the Jews are looking to set up a place that they'll be free and that they won't have any political issues. He says, so to that effect, we can actually answer the Eastern question with the Jewish question. He says, we're going to make it an international area, not in the sense that we understand it today, but under the custodianship of the Jewish people that is guaranteed by the world imperial powers. But he very much sees Jerusalem as the heart of the issue. Herzl brings him in. He goes back and forth many times to London. He's very famous with the chief rabbi of England over there at the time, Rabbi Gaster. They're very good friends. And he's invited to be part of the first. Rabbi Mendes is talking about these ideas from the early 1890s. By 1897, Herzl invites him to be one of the key people at the conference in Basel, Switzerland, the first Zionist Congress. And then he also dispatches him to be the representative of the Congress in the United States and to introduce and disseminate the ideals of Zionism to the United States. Absolutely fantastic. Oh, whoops. Sorry. Having some trouble here. Sorry, bear with me 1 minute. Now, of course, there's two streams of consciousness that are going on in the conference, in the first Zionist Congress. One is the approach of Herzl, Weizmann, and others, which is a secular Zionism that has nothing to do with the Jewish past. And then there is the Zionism of Dr. Max Nordau and of Rabbi Mendes. And there is no difference between Judaism and Zionism. I would venture to say that most of the people on this Zoom call have a similar approach. So the famous quote is highlighted there on the bottom of Max Nordau: Judaism is Zionism, and Zionism is Judaism. And when he comes back from the conference from Switzerland, back to the United States, and from his pulpit in Sheretz Israel, he writes an article, Rabbi Mendes, to disseminate to all the Jews, telling them what happened at the conference, and he echoes and he quotes this directly from Dr. Max Nordau. Now, he was very keen on, he said, Jews can do whatever they want, and they can engage with the powers, as the Jews ended up doing, right? We worked with the United Nations, etc., and with England. He said, but we have to be very careful. He says, Israel comes to the Jewish people from the Torah, from God. So we're not asking them for permission. He says, if we believe in the Torah, the Christian and the Muslim nations will also have respect for us in turn, because that's what their religious writings respect our religious writings. And therefore, on a religious and a spiritual basis, they will have to accept a Jewish Zionistic vision. So on the left is a great, quote that really highlights, and that's also his approach to Orthodox Judaism. He says, you want the Goyim to respect you as a Jew? He says they're not gonna respect you more because you eat pork. They're not gonna respect you more because you Halal Shabbat. He says that respect we can have only if we respect ourselves by respecting our religion. Here is the true work for the Zionists, to keep Hebrew true to Jewish life, Jewish law, and Jewish sentiment. Meaning, if you want people to respect you, the first step is to respect yourselves. Now, as time goes on, he gets older. He's not always able to attend the following Zionist congresses, but before, I think it's the 7th Zionist Congress, he reminds and he writes a letter to many of his followers, and he writes on the right. This really speaks, I think, to his wider vision of Zionism and something that we should internalize today. And what is this whole project that we're talking about with Zionism? He says, let Zionists aim to make Hebrews worthy of God's interference on our behalf. Who can argue that the Six-Day War is nothing short of a miracle? Even today, look at what's going on with Corona. There's some doctors on this call, maybe they can write in, but I have an issue in that I haven't seen anything written that clearly outlines why Israel has such a disparate result in the coronavirus. There is no explanation against God, except God. In my personal opinion, I've spoken to some medical doctors, it makes absolutely no sense. People that say the population density is very low, it's simply not true. The population density, especially in Israel cities, is extremely high. I have relatives that live there. They were all strict to an extent. People went out to buy groceries the same that they did over here. So it's very unclear why they had a lower occurrence of corona, except for God. Anyway, let Zionists initiate a spiritual movement to turn Hebrews from transgressions in lands where Sabbath is desecrated, intermarriage is socially glossed, and Bible ordinances are lightly set aside. He says, Zionism is an inspiration. Zionism should be an inspiration to turn Jews back to having respect for themselves and have adherence to Torah mitzvot. Zionism is a Jewish question, therefore it is a religious question. Therefore we desire Palestine, not for a legally assured home only, for we have homes legally assured in England, France, Germany, and America with assurance, which means much more than under the pashas of a sultan. No, we desire Palestine as a spiritual influence for the benefit, not of the Hebrews only, but for the benefit of all mankind. In thee and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And that last part, he actually spoke about quite a bit. He takes that from right after Akedat Yitzhak. He says, this is one of the charges of the Jewish people. God says, after Abraham Avinu doesn't sacrifice Yitzhak, he says, he blesses him, but he says, all of the world will be blessed because of the Jews. And he says, Zionism shouldn't be looked at as some kind of specific thing that is only going to benefit Jews. He says, no, Zionism will benefit the entire world. And indeed, we see that today with all the technological marvels that are coming out of Israel, that is nothing short of true. And he even takes it a step further. He says, the Bible ideals of universal peace, universal brotherhood, and universal happiness, the destiny to carry all, to share with him spiritual aspirations with make for righteousness. The mission of Zionism is the strengthening of Jewish sentiment for good in order that it may logically be the conservative influence above mentioned, meaning the keeping of Torah mitzvot. This then is the end of Zionism, to found a model government, a model state of society, a model system of education. He says, by being where we're supposed to be, by observing mitzvot, we'll create a model society which will be the envy of the world. And he says that's a national charge, but he also says that we also have individual responsibility. The task of the coming Congress of Zionists is to devise, he writes this before one of the congresses, he says, whereby every Zionist society shall become a power for the spiritual benefit of the community in which it exists, whereby God shall be interwoven in human life, and reverence, righteousness, responsibility become actual life forces. Let every Zionist illustrate God's laws by the life he leads, meaning if you want to do the best thing for Zionism, it's to do Torah mitzvot, and by the communal life he supports. So he really charges the individual and puts quite a bit on the individual, challenging them to take personal responsibility in their role in Zionism. A big part of that having to do with Torah Mitzvot. Now, that being said, there's so much more to say about Rabbi Mendes, but I think, the question I opened up is, first of all, how come you never heard of Rabbi Mendes? And that's something you should go back and ask yourselves, considering how influential, how important he was for American Jewish experience. But number two, what does Zionism look like for us? What does Zionism look like maybe to our children that are in Jewish school? What does our Zionism look like for our children that are going to colleges? How do we teach them to be not only proud Zionists, but also proud Jews? Can we actually separate the two? Are they two mutually distinct things? According to Rabbi Mendes, those are one and the same. To be a good Jew is to be a good Zionist, and to be a good Zionist is a good Jew. And that being said, if anybody has any questions, if anybody would like to open, I'd like to open it up for a little bit of discussion. You can either type into the chat box over here, or you can raise your hand, and I'd be happy to call on you. I don't think I have the ability to unmute. I don't have the ability to unmute, unfortunately, but if anybody puts a question, I'd be more than happy to discuss any topic that maybe I didn't have time to discuss.
Murray, hi, it's Odette.
Hi.
How are you? My question is, you're saying that we have density, Israel has density, but so many Jews were affected by this corona in New York. So many. Much more severe than in Israel, because they know how to take care of things there. And then maybe the people listen over there, or they were going to give them fines. Over here, they weren't giving out fines.
Again, so statistically, we had, just to give you an idea of how disparate the numbers are, in New York, we had more deaths than Israel total had cases. So while I hear what you're saying, I don't believe it. And, I know I have two sisters that are living there. A lot of the young people, single people, did not take it so seriously. People that are running homes, they still went out. They had to go to the grocery stores. I don't think there's any real answer to the question of it, why there's such a disparity in results, except for Hashem.
They did take it. They did take it seriously there, Murray. Alba was in the house with 7 children. They did take it seriously. They did. They listened to the
rules. So if to play devil's advocate, right? There was a lot of backlash that the Haredi populations weren't keeping it at all. So meaning in Bnei Brak, in certain neighborhoods of Jerusalem, et cetera, and like they really weren't. They were having, minyanim and kanis. They were disobeying the orders. Most of the cases were in these communities in Israel. But despite that, the numbers were still not even close to the United States. So, and especially New York. New York is almost, New York is about 8 million people. It's even more real. New York is probably 10 million people. Israel total is 8 million people. The numbers just don't add up. I just want to move on. I don't want to belabor. I don't want to belabor the point. Where did Rabbi Mendes stand on the Shemitah issue? I'm not sure. It's a good question. I don't know. All the mitzvot tiliyot ba'aretz, I don't know. Moshe Mizrachi is asking, in Israel, they were spraying people who were congregating with water tanks. Those were protesters. But it's a good point. No, there's no question that Israel took it perhaps more seriously than we did. But despite that, it still doesn't make sense that they had such a disparity. Joy Braha, what's your working definition of Zionism? Great question, Joy. Thank you for that question. Zionism, when you say Zionism, right, and you're talking with people, it's very interesting because it's one of those things where everybody could be talking about Zionism in the room, but everybody has a different working definition of Zionism. So for my personal, what I call Zionism and what other people call Zionism might be different. But for what Rabbi Mendes, he called it, he specifically did not look at Zionism as some secular political movement. He looked at it as the fruitions of the Nevuot and the culmination or the trajectory of what the Torah was trying to accomplish. So to him, what is Zionism? Zionism is world peace. What is Zionism? Zionism is the fruition of the Nevuot of Yeshaya and Micha. So that's Rabbi Mendes's version. So everybody can have a different one, but I think for many of us, that's certainly part of our Zionist vision, to have political autonomy in the spirit of the Torah and mitzvot. One shouldn't have to sacrifice the other. We shouldn't need to sacrifice our observance of Torah and mitzvot in order to have a state. Anyway, that being said, I wish everybody a happy Yom Yerushalayim. I think it's a great time to reflect upon the miracles of the state of Israel, specifically the unification of Yerushalayim in our times. It's nothing short of a miracle when you look at the history of the Six-Day War that we were able to, in our lifetimes, see and be able to live and visit freely Yerushalayim. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and thank you for tuning in.